I looked her dead in the eye while the tow truck driver asked me which car to haul, and I pointed at hers. She'd just tried to tow my work van off my own driveway. So I smiled and said, "Let's make it fair, Karen. Let's tow both." You should have seen her face when I handed him my city permit and her name on the street closure request. She said I couldn't use my own driveway? So I shut down the entire street. Legally. That's how it started. Not with anger, not with yelling, but with a cold, calculated smile and a clipboard. Let me rewind to how we got there. The thing about Maplethorne Street was that it had always been one of those neighborhoods where people kept to themselves but waved politely. We weren't exactly best friends, but we'd pull each other's trash bins up the curb on windy days, and I once spent 3 hours helping old Mrs. Eleanor replant her flower beds after a raccoon massacre. That kind of place. That is, until Karen moved in. She came in like a blonde wrecking ball with a Lexus and a bad attitude. Within a week, she had filed her first HOA complaint against the neighborhood kids for sidewalk chalk. Yes, chalk. By the end of the month, she had appointed herself the enforcement arm of the HOA. I honestly think she bought the corner lot just so she could see more houses at once. I had just started a side project renovating my garage into a dual workspace and home gym. I work as a structural engineer, so this was partly for fun, partly to save me the commute to a sweaty downtown office full of bad coffee and people who say synergy without blinking. To do this, I needed to use my own driveway for temporary storage. Plywood stacks, insulation rolls, a few neatly parked pallets of materials. Nothing junky, nothing blocking the sidewalk or spilling over onto the street. But Karen had other plans. She strutted over on the second day of delivery like she owned the block, heels clicking on the pavement like a countdown to idiocy. She didn't even say hello. She pointed at my work van and said, "You can't park that there." I laughed, honestly thinking it was a joke. But her squint didn't waver, and the HOA-branded clipboard she clutched in her talons told me she was serious. I tried reasoning with her. This is my driveway. The materials are temporary. It's all permitted and legal. She raised a hand like a traffic cop mid-power trip. The HOA has strict visual guidelines. You're lowering the aesthetic cohesion of the street. I blinked. She just said my van was ruining the vibe. I asked if she wanted to see the renovation permit. She refused. She actually said, "That's between you and the city. But I speak for the neighborhood." I looked around. The neighborhood was a guy walking his dog, an old woman gardening, and my buddy Rick peeking through his blinds like he was watching a soap opera. No one backed her up. But that didn't stop her. The next morning, a red tag was duct-taped to my van's windshield. Unauthorized vehicle. HOA citation. I found out later that Karen had printed it herself. It was a fake, but professional-looking, complete with a watermark that was just her signature in Comic Sans. I removed it and shrugged it off, until the following week when a real tow truck showed up. That's when it got real. I came home from the hardware store and saw my van tilted at a 30-degree angle, halfway up the truck's lift. Karen was standing beside the driver, pointing like a general on a battlefield. I rushed over, shouting, "This is private property. You can't tow from my driveway." The driver looked confused, checked his paperwork, and said, "This order came from the HOA. Is this not communal property?" I nearly choked. "This is my house. That's my driveway. That's my van. And that," I pointed at Karen, "is a lunatic." Karen interrupted, "You were warned. You're disrupting the neighborhood." "We voted." I asked, "Who's we?" She gestured vaguely, like she had ghosts backing her. "The board." I asked for the tow order. She showed me her clipboard. I pulled out my phone and started recording. I zoomed in on her fake HOA badge. Yes, she wore one. It literally said, HOA Compliance Enforcer with a gold star sticker. Then came the moment that changed everything. The tow truck driver, clearly uncomfortable, looked between us and said, "Look, I'm just doing what the paperwork says. If there's a mistake, call the city." I got a permit. A permit? From the city? That's when something clicked. I asked to see it, and sure enough, there was a permit number. And guess who had requested it? Karen. Somehow, she had faked a temporary road enforcement request to justify the tow. That was all I needed. I told the driver to lower the van immediately, and he complied once I showed him my title, ID, and renovation permit. Karen sputtered and stormed off, saying she'd be back with reinforcements. That night I didn't sleep. I planned. I pulled out my work laptop, opened city zoning access portals, and began requesting a formal street use permit. Unlike Karen's shady backchannel request, mine went through the right way. I knew the codes, the access points, the permit fees. The next morning, I made a few calls to city officials I'd worked with on commercial build. By noon, I had approval, not just to use my driveway, but to temporarily block the entire street for safety and structural load testing related to my garage expansion. A legal, enforceable, 2-week road closure. And I just ordered 6 steel barricades, 4 warning signs, 2 flashing light beacons, and a sign that read, Authorized Vehicles Only, Permit #8392A. When Karen came outside that evening to walk her little fluff dog in its pink vest, she saw my driveway lined with equipment, my work van safe, and her Lexus blocked in by 2 bright orange barriers. She screamed, "What is this?" I handed her the laminated permit like it was a VIP ticket to humiliation. "Streets closed, Karen. You said I couldn't use my driveway. So now, no one's using the street. Hope you don't mind a little inconvenience." She was speechless. It was the first time I'd seen her mouth open without words coming out. I walked away, camera still recording in my hand, smiling. The war had officially begun. The day after the street was officially closed, the neighborhood looked like it had been dropped into the middle of a construction zone. Barricades framed the intersection like a fortress entrance. Warning signs were planted at both ends of the block, reading temporary closure, city authorized work zone. A blinking beacon stood right in front of Karen's pristine white Lexus. The silence from her side of the property was louder than her usual screeching. She hadn't come outside since the shock of the previous evening. I imagined she was sitting at her kitchen window, gripping a coffee mug and plotting her next tantrum. I wasn't trying to punish anyone but her, and ironically, the rest of the street loved it. Mr. Rodriguez across the road actually thanked me. He said the peace from traffic was a blessing and his grandkids could finally ride their bikes without Karen storming out yelling about wheel noise. Even Rick, who usually avoided neighborhood drama like it was radioactive, gave me a thumbs up while watering his lawn. A few people walked by just to chuckle at the new barricades and my very official sign with the permit number clearly printed in bold font. I didn't just want this to be legal, I wanted it to be undeniable. Later that afternoon, while I was organizing insulation sheets on the driveway, a car tried to pull into the block. I recognized the vehicle. It was one of Karen's friends, the woman with the oversized sunglasses and license plate that literally said, Fabgirl. She stopped in front of the barrier and honked. I didn't move. She honked again. I approached casually and said, "Sorry, streets closed. Authorized vehicles only." She rolled down her window and shouted, "I'm here to see Karen. Move those things." I held up the laminated permit and pointed to the blinking lights. "City order. You'll have to park somewhere else." She scoffed, reversed, and peeled away like it was a fast and furious audition. An hour later, Karen finally emerged. She came storming toward me in a full-length athletic outfit like she'd just come from a furious power walk inside her own house. She didn't even try to pretend this was a misunderstanding. She just launched into it. "This is harassment. You can't close off the whole block. You're punishing the entire neighborhood." I calmly picked up a piece of drywall and answered, "The city approved it. You said my van was an eyesore. So I'm doing proper load testing on driveway expansion. That requires street clearance. Safety first." She pointed at my equipment and shrieked, "That is not testing. That's you being petty. I turned to her with a straight face. You tried to tow my van. From my property. Using a forged order. This isn't petty. This is permitted. She screamed something unintelligible and stormed back to her house, nearly tripping over her own dog. Later that evening, I heard a loud knock on my door. When I opened it, 2 uniformed police officers stood there. Karen stood behind them with her arms folded like a villain in a soap opera, expecting a grand arrest scene. One of the officers politely asked if they could talk. I invited them in, already prepared. As they stepped inside, I pulled out a folder with all the paperwork: zoning approval, street closure request, construction safety requirements, equipment rental receipt. They flipped through it and nodded. Karen stood at the door, yelling from behind the screen like she was still part of the conversation. He's weaponizing city permits. He's shutting us all in. He blocked my friend's car with a sign. The officer closed the folder, looked at me, then at her, and said, "Ma'am, everything here appears legal. In fact, this is one of the most detailed permit packages I've ever seen." I could barely contain my smirk. Karen sputtered, pointed one more time, and finally gave up, slamming her front door behind her hard enough to rattle her porch lights. The police left, wishing me good luck with the project, and said I should let them know if there were any more disturbances. I appreciated their professionalism, and honestly, it helped solidify what I already suspected. Karen was losing grip on the story she thought she controlled. She was used to people backing down when she barked, but I wasn't giving her that satisfaction. I wasn't yelling. I wasn't threatening. I was simply playing by the rules, better than she ever could. That night, I noticed something strange. My trash bins had been tipped over and dragged halfway into the street. Someone had popped the lid off a paint can and dumped it behind my work van. I knew exactly who had done it. What she hadn't counted on was the new security system I'd installed last week. I had set up 2 night vision motion-activated cameras. One aimed at the driveway, one at the street. I reviewed the footage and there it was. Karen, wearing a hoodie, creeping out at midnight with a bag of trash and a bucket of paint. It was cartoon villain behavior at this point. I saved the footage and made 3 copies. One for the HOA, one for the city's compliance office, and one for myself. But I wasn't going to report it yet. I wanted to see how far she would go. The next day, I added a new sign to the barricade. Under video surveillance, all vandalism will be prosecuted. That morning, I caught her peeking through her blinds like a raccoon near a spotlight. She knew she was caught, but she didn't know how badly. Then came the mail drop. An official-looking envelope arrived in my mailbox, marked from the HOA board. Inside was a citation, a fine for disruption of shared community access and unauthorized use of safety equipment. I nearly laughed myself off the porch. It was clearly written by Karen. I could tell from the way she capitalized random words like neighborhood discord and visual clutter. I scanned the document, checked for real signatures, and found none. Not even the board chair had signed off. She had gone rogue again. So I did what any sane person would do. I scanned the letter, redacted my address, and posted it online with the title, "Karen the HOA Queen fined me for using my driveway, so I shut down the street." I uploaded it to Reddit's Entitled People subreddit, added a few before and after photos, a shot of the barricade with the city permit, and let the internet do its thing. Within 3 hours, it had 5,000 upvote. People were commenting things like, "This is how you handle power-tripping neighbors," and "Permit game strong." Some even suggested I sell t-shirts that said, "I legally shut down my street." The internet was solidly on my side. By the end of the day, a local news reporter reached out asking if they could do a short segment on the situation. I declined, didn't want to start a war just yet, but I could feel the tide shifting. Karen wasn't just losing this little fight. She was losing the illusion of control she'd built around herself. The neighborhood was watching, the internet was watching, and now she was backed into a corner with no real power left except the kind she tried to fake with citations and screeching. The next morning, my doorbell rang. It wasn't the police this time. It was Eleanor, the sweet old woman who lived 3 doors down. She brought cookies. Real warm cookies. She said, "Thank you for standing up to her. She's been terrorizing us for years, but no one knew how to fight back without stooping to her level." I invited her in, and we had coffee on the porch while she told me stories I couldn't believe, like the time Karen tried to have Eleanor's bird feeder removed because it was encouraging pests. I realized that this was bigger than just my driveway. This was the entire street finally taking a breath. The barricades were still up. The driveway was still mine. And for once, Karen had nothing left to say. By the time the week rolled into Friday, the entire street had grown comfortable with the barricades like they were part of some quirky neighborhood art exhibit. Kids had started drawing chalk cartoons on the asphalt in the newly car-free zone, and elderly neighbors who rarely stepped outside were now walking the street like it was a pedestrian promenade. It was peaceful, it was safe, and aside from one bitterly furious woman behind the white door with 6 security cameras pointed at her porch, nobody seemed to have a problem. Except Karen, of course. She wasn't just bothered anymore, she was seething. And when people like Karen start losing power, they don't go quietly. They organize meetings. It began with an emergency flyer taped to every mailbox on the block, printed in bold red ink with phrases like community disorder, escalating abuse of power, and neighborhood crisis forum. At the bottom, in all caps, it read mandatory HOA emergency session, attendance required. There was no official HOA letterhead, no board signatures. Just Karen's name and her phone number written in pen. I stood by my mailbox laughing. She was desperate now. I could smell it in her fonts. Still, curiosity got the better of me. The meeting was scheduled for Saturday afternoon in the clubhouse at the end of the street, a building rarely used unless someone was hosting a bake sale or a lukewarm election for HOA treasurer. I arrived early, partly to claim a spot near the back where I could observe without getting dragged into one of her verbal traps. The room filled slowly, a mix of people who looked confused, annoyed, or bored. Karen stood at the front like a disgraced politician trying to claw her way back into office, papers clutched in her hands, eyes darting like she expected applause that never came. The moment everyone was seated, she launched into a dramatic speech. She called my renovation a hostile blockade. She described the street closure as a siege. She claimed I had created a legal loophole that weaponized city permits against neighbors. She didn't mention the part where she tried to have my van towed from my own property. She didn't mention the fake violation tags or the paint she poured behind my van. She painted herself as a victim of what she called an aggressive and manipulative intimidation campaign. Her voice trembled not with emotion, but with the rage of someone who was used to controlling the narrative and now couldn't even get eye contact. A few neighbors shifted uncomfortably. Others stared down at their lap. And then a miracle happened. Eleanor, sweet old Eleanor, slowly stood up from her folding chair near the snack table. Everyone turned toward her, and Karen paused mid-sentence. Eleanor looked straight ahead and said, "I'd like to speak." Karen opened her mouth to protest, but the murmur from the crowd shut her down. Eleanor cleared her throat and said, "I have lived on this street for 28 years. And in that time, I have seen a lot. But nothing has made me feel more unsafe, more dismissed, and more harassed than the past few months since Karen moved in." The silence that followed could have cracked glass. Eleanor took a step forward and pulled a folded sheet of paper from her handbag. "Karen has threatened me over my garden, my flag placement, even the color of my birdbath. She once left a note on my door saying I had 5 days to remove my wind chimes or face fines." Karen tried to interrupt, but Eleanor raised her hand and kept going. "I never said anything before because I thought maybe it was just me. But when I saw what she did to Dylan, trying to tow his vehicle, blocking his work, falsifying HOA documents, I knew I wasn't alone. The dam broke. One by one, others started speaking. Mr. Patel talked about how Karen tried to stop his daughter's birthday party because of the noise. The Lees mentioned a mysterious HOA warning that arrived 2 days after their son rode a skateboard past her driveway. Even Rick stood up and said, "I never said anything, but she put a warning letter in my mailbox because I left my Christmas lights up until January 6th. The room was filled with a shared sense of relief, like the neighborhood was finally waking from a long, passive nightmare. Karen stood frozen, holding her stack of papers like they had just turned to ash. The HOA board chair, Mr. Holloway, who up until then had been mostly silent in meetings, finally stood up. He had a mild voice, the kind you'd expect from a retired accountant, but when he spoke now, there was steel in it. "Based on what I've heard today, and recent complaints brought to my attention," he said, "we will be suspending Karen from any enforcement role within the HOA effective immediately, pending an internal review." The room practically erupted in satisfied murmurs. Karen's mouth opened and closed a few times like she was underwater. She shouted something about legal action and stormed out of the building, her heels clicking furiously against the tile. After the meeting, people lingered like it was the end of a church service where nobody wanted to leave too quickly. I got pats on the back, thank yous, even a couple of high fives. Someone suggested I run for the HOA board. I declined with a laugh. I'd already waged my battle, and I had no intention of turning into a bureaucrat with a badge. I just wanted my driveway and my peace. But something had changed that afternoon. For the first time, the neighborhood felt connected, not in a forced community newsletter way, but in a real, human way. And that had everything to do with one woman's downfall. The next morning, my cameras picked up Karen dragging a plastic bin filled with papers to her curb. She dumped it all into her recycling bin: pamphlets, flyers, clipboards, her fake citation forms. It was like watching a general burn her failed battle plans. She didn't even look toward my house. She just marched back inside and shut the door. For the first time since she moved in, the blinds stayed shut all day. By Monday, she had removed the HOA Compliance Enforcer sticker from her mailbox and taken down the multiple surveillance signs she had plastered across her lawn. I didn't gloat. I didn't throw a party. I simply got back to work. I finished installing the insulation, set up the new lighting in the garage, and reorganized my tools. With the driveway cleared and the project wrapping up, I emailed the city office to confirm the end of the road closure. They replied with a cheerful message thanking me for textbook adherence to protocol. When the barricades came down later that week, it felt like the grand finale of a stage play. But unlike before, the street wasn't returning to how it was. The block had changed. People greeted each other more. Kids played outside longer. Even the most introverted neighbors started to linger in their yards. It was like the whole street had exhaled. And somewhere behind a tightly sealed door, Karen was realizing that the very people she tried to control had decided to live better without her permission. As I watched the last city worker haul away the blinking beacon from the curb, I couldn't help but grin. Not because I'd won something petty, but because I hadn't let her win. She tried to take my driveway. I took back the street. Not through chaos, but through calm, calculated resolve. And that, more than anything, drove her crazy. Just when I thought things might quiet down, when the barricades were gone and my garage renovations were nearly complete, the neighborhood eased into something that resembled normal. Even the birds seemed to chirp differently, as if they sensed the tension had lifted. People started hosting driveway barbecues, kids were out with water guns, and the kind of small talk that had disappeared when Karen arrived returned to front porches like a long-lost friend. But Karen wasn't done. She had lost the HOA role, the trust of the street, and whatever illusion of power she used to carry. And like any storm that loses structure, she became more dangerous, more erratic, and far less predictable. It began with something small, almost laughable. One morning, I found a lawn flamingo stabbed into the ground near my mailbox with a note taped to its beak. The note read, "Still watching. Still reporting. No name, no handwriting that I recognized, but it reeked of Karen's flair for unnecessary drama. I left it exactly where it was, like a trophy of ridiculousness, and added a smiley face sticker to the note. By the next morning, it was gone, likely retrieved by the same hands that delivered it. But it was a signal. She was still spiraling, still clawing at the illusion that she had any control left. A few nights later, I heard something rustling around the side of my house. I paused the movie I was watching and peeked out the side window. My motion lights flicked on and caught a figure darting back toward the street. I quickly checked the security camera feed, rewound 30 seconds, and watched as someone in a hoodie and gloves snuck up to my trash bins and dumped something inside. I went outside with a flashlight and found that the bags weren't mine. They were leaking something sticky, and the smell was sour and rotten, like she had intentionally stored garbage just long enough to let it ferment. I didn't touch it. I called sanitation and showed them the footage. They retrieved it the next morning and flagged the incident with the city as targeted illegal dumping. That was her new strategy. Sabotage. She had tried paperwork, tried manipulation, even tried public humiliation. None of it had worked. Now she was resorting to petty vandalism. But I had an idea. I didn't just want to catch her. I wanted to expose her, undeniably, to the exact people she had once tried to rule over. So I upgraded my surveillance setup. I installed a second high-resolution camera with low-light enhancement and infrared tracking. It was aimed specifically at the side fence that separated our properties. I added a solar-powered floodlight with a motion sensor and set up a backup cloud recording system so that no footage could be tampered with. I knew it was only a matter of time before she struck again. Sure enough, 4 days later, just past midnight, the floodlight triggered. I got a ping on my phone. I opened the live feed and there she was. Karen, wearing her infamous pink hoodie and black yoga pants, crouching beside my recycling bin with a screwdriver in one hand and a bag of what looked like spoiled food in the other. She had this wild, focused look in her eyes like she was on a mission from some twisted deity of neighborhood order. She unscrewed the side panel of the bin, shoved the bag inside, and sealed it back up. She turned to leave, then looked straight into the camera. It was like she realized in that moment that she had just been caught in the act with the clarity of daylight. She froze, blinked, then ran. I didn't post the footage right away. I sent it first to the city's code enforcement office and copied the HOA board. I filed a complaint for harassment, vandalism, and trespassing. The next day, I got a call from a compliance officer who told me that Karen had already been under review for misappropriation of HOA resources during her time on the board. They had reason to believe she had funneled funds for personal landscaping projects and home surveillance that had never been approved. My footage gave them just the push they needed. The following week, the city launched an official audit. Karen's name became a whisper around the block. People started talking again, more openly now, about her behavior. Turns out she had charged neighbors for imaginary, finable offenses, and pocketed the cash under the table. One family said she made them pay for repainting their mailbox even though the mailbox wasn't even theirs. It belonged to a shared complex that she claimed she managed. Another neighbor revealed she used to send threatening letters about violating holiday decoration timelines, even though no such rule existed. It was as if she had created her own dictatorship under the guise of HOA compliance. But the final straw wasn't the sabotage or the trash or the ghost fines. It was the post. One morning I woke up to find a folded newsletter on my front porch with the heading, "The True Story of Mapplethorne's Destruction." It was printed on glossy paper and featured photos of my house, my driveway, even my car, all taken without consent. The narrative inside was unhinged. She painted herself as the brave protector of the neighborhood who had tried to stop a dangerous man from creating chaos. She accused me of fraud, bullying, even claimed I had bribed city officials for my permit. The thing was so unhinged that it circled back to being hilarious. But she had crossed a legal line now. unauthorized photos, defamation, and distribution of false claims. That was when I went public. I uploaded the trash footage, the vandalism clip, and a scan of her bizarre newsletter to the same Reddit thread I had started weeks ago. This time, it exploded. It hit the front page. Tens of thousands of people commented, shared it, turned it into memes. Someone even edited her newsletter with glitter emojis and made it into a printable coloring book. A local journalist saw the thread and followed up with a short investigative piece on community abuse of power. He requested an interview, and this time I said yes. The piece aired on a Sunday night. Karen's face, blurred but unmistakable in posture and voice, appeared on screen beside the phrase, HOA terror or concerned citizen? The fallout was swift. The city finalized its audit and ruled that Karen had, in fact, misused funds. She was fined thousands of dollars, stripped of any future right to serve on HOA boards in the state, and placed under legal review for harassment. The HOA board held a vote to permanently ban her from participating in any enforcement activity. That vote was unanimous. And the neighbors? They celebrated. Rick hosted a pizza party. Mr. Patel set up a backyard movie night and projected the Reddit thread on a screen. Eleanor baked a cake with the words, "Goodbye Dictator," written in red frosting. Karen didn't show her face outside for a week. Her blinds stayed drawn. No Lexus in the driveway. No late-night trash runs. Just silence. Then one morning, a "for sale" sign appeared on her lawn. Just like that. No announcement, no farewell, no apology. The house was listed under a private agent with a description that suspiciously failed to mention anything about a tight-knit community. I didn't dance on her porch or toast champagne. I just watered my plants and kept building my garage's final shelves, knowing she had finally run out of move. The street had turned a corner. And though it was never my goal to become a neighborhood hero, somehow that's where I'd ended up. Not through anger or revenge, but through holding the line, through cameras, permits, and quiet resolve. The only person who had truly embarrassed Karen was Karen herself. All I did was show the world what was already there. It would have been poetic if Karen had just faded quietly into the background, her house sold, her name forgotten, her clipboard buried in the backyard alongside her petty citations and flamingo threats. But that wasn't Karen's way. No, she had one final card to play, one last desperate move to reclaim some sense of dignity from the pile of legal documents and neighborhood shame she had buried herself under. It started with a knock at my door, not from her, but from a process server who handed me a thick envelope without saying a word. Inside was a lawsuit. Karen was suing me for emotional distress, reputational damage, property devaluation, and what she claimed was a coordinated defamation campaign that had made her a national mockery. She wanted $50,000 in damages and a formal apology in writing. I read it 3 times and laughed each time harder than the last. It wasn't even the amount she asked for or the absurdity of her claims that got me. It was the sheer irony. Karen, who had stalked my driveway, sabotaged my bins, and passed out newsletters accusing me of bribery, was now accusing me of character assassination. I sat down, made a fresh cup of coffee, and called my sister. She wasn't just family, she was a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, but one with a specialization in civil defense and a habit of dismantling weak cases like they were a puzzle missing half the pieces. I scanned the lawsuit and sent it to her. She called me back an hour later, laughing too. Her exact words were, "I'm going to enjoy this." We showed up to the courthouse 3 weeks later. Karen was already seated when we walked in, wearing a navy suit that looked like it had been borrowed from a courtroom drama. She was alone, having refused legal representation because she believed no one could tell her story better than she could. That turned out to be a tragic miscalculation. The judge glanced over the paperwork, listened to her long-winded explanation of how I had ruined her life through psychological warfare via municipal loopholes, and then turned to my sister, who calmly laid out the timeline of events. Her false towing attempt, her forged violations, the recorded footage of vandalism, the newsletter filled with slanderous accusations, and the public defamation that backfired on her. Then she added the footage, which we had burned to disk and submitted with the filing. The judge watched the video of Karen sneaking around my property with a bag of trash like she was on a spy mission gone wrong, and just sighed. Karen tried to object, claiming the video was manipulated, but the judge waved it off. The court dismissed her lawsuit in under an hour and ordered her to pay all legal fees. As we walked out, Karen sat frozen in her seat, hands clasped like she had just woken from a dream and realized she had been the villain the whole time. That was the last time I saw her in person. A week later, the moving trucks arrived. Slowly, piece by piece, the house she had turned into a surveillance bunker was emptied. The security cameras came down, the HOA signs were removed, and the blinds were finally opened to reveal a lifeless interior stripped of all the fake authority it once projected. By the time the truck left, the house looked like it had exhaled. A simple white sign in the yard read "Sold." No contact info, no open house. Just gone. The neighborhood didn't throw a party, but you could feel the celebration in the air. People walked with a little more spring in their step. The kids chalked the sidewalks again. Someone even wrote "Free at last" in bubble letters on the street where the barricade had once stood. Rick came over that evening and handed me a six-pack and a lawn chair. "You ever think of running for mayor?" he joked. I shook my head. "One war at a time, man." But I understood what he meant. I hadn't just built a garage or defended my driveway. I'd drawn a line against abuse masquerading as authority. And the neighborhood saw it. 2 weeks later, the house went dark again. No new owners yet, just silence. I figured the story was over. I was wrong. Out of nowhere, a letter arrived. Handwritten. No return address. I opened it and my jaw dropped. It was from Karen. The letter was surprisingly civil, even remorseful. She claimed she had made mistakes, that she let stress cloud her better judgment, and she hoped I would accept a delayed apology for everything. She didn't admit to anything directly, but the tone was of someone who had been broken down and, in the quiet moments after the storm, found the courage to look at her reflection without flinching. I folded the letter and placed it in my filing cabinet. Not to hold a grudge, but to remind myself how close peace can be to chaos. Eventually, new neighbors moved into the house. A young couple with a toddler and a golden retriever. They brought cookies to every house on the block and asked if anyone wanted to join a weekend cleanup crew for the park nearby. The change was instant. Where once there was cold surveillance and rigid rules, there was now warmth and laughter and sidewalk chalk again. I helped them fix their garage door one Saturday and casually mentioned the history of the house. They laughed, said they'd heard whispers of a woman with a clipboard, but didn't care. They were just glad to be here. As for me, I finished the garage. Added a gym rack, a tool wall, even a small office space where I could take on freelance work without ever having to see another cubicle. The driveway became a symbol not just of my property rights but of resistance against unnecessary control. Sometimes I'd sit on the edge of it in the evenings, sipping a drink while the neighborhood buzzed gently in the background. It was peaceful again. Not because we had rules or HOA meetings or self-appointed officers, but because we all finally understood that living together means letting people live. I still get messages online about the Reddit thread. People ask for updates, send memes, and sometimes share their own Karen stories. It's become a weird badge of honor. But I never forget how close it all came to unraveling. One misplaced citation, one forged tow order, one woman drunk on authority. That was all it took to light the fuse. But with patience, strategy, and a little bit of humor, the fuse didn't just fizzle out, it illuminated every corner she tried to hide in. The story that began with a woman saying I couldn't use my own driveway ended with her losing the street, the HOA, the respect of every neighbor, and ultimately, the home she once ruled like a tyrant. Not because I fought dirty, but because I didn't fight her way. I didn't scream, didn't threaten. I just let the truth speak louder than her volume. And that was enough. Some wars aren't won with weapons. They're won with permits, patience, and the kind of stubbornness that keeps you from ever backing into your garage just because someone said you couldn't.